Brody Vance snapped the second carbon fiber crutch over his knee and dropped the broken pieces into the mud at Khloe Miller's feet. She sank lower against the wet asphalt, her fingers digging into the gravel, her whole body bracing against the freezing Seattle rain. "They destroyed my crutches," Khloe's voice cracked as she stared at the shattered carbon fiber. Those crutches weren't just medical equipment. They were her dignity, paid for by 8 months of exhausting night shifts at a grocery store. Then, a thunderous roar ripped through the storm. A man in a leather Hell's Angels vest cut his engine and knelt beside her. He didn't say a word, but as he looked from the broken carbon fiber to her tear-stained face, something in his eyes shifted forever. This is Heart Tales. Stay with us, because 24 hours later, 70 Hell's Angels members did something that left an entire university administration frozen in stunned silence. Now, let's find out what happened that day. The second crutch snapped with a sharp crack that sounded entirely too loud in the empty parking lot. Brody Vance didn't look angry. He just looked bored, or maybe amused, as he dropped the broken black carbon fiber pieces into the mud right by Khloe's boots. He was still holding his phone out, keeping the camera angled down toward the ground where she was trying to keep her balance. His friends, Tyler and Marcus, stood a few feet back under the concrete awning of the engineering building, laughing quietly as if they were watching a funny video online rather than a real girl sitting in the freezing rain. They were the kind of young men who never had to worry about the cost of anything. Brody's family name was literally carved into the stone over the library doors. For boys like him, the world didn't have rules, only suggestions. "Come on, Khloe," Brody said, his voice casual, almost friendly. "We just wanted to see if the rumors were true. The guys on the team said you couldn't even make it to the curb without these things." Khloe didn't say anything. She couldn't. Her hands were pressed hard against the wet asphalt, gravel biting into her palms, but she barely felt the sting. The cold rain was soaking straight through her denim jacket, freezing her skin, but the only thing she could focus on was the splintered carbon fiber lying in the dark puddle. She was 21 years old, and for exactly 4 years, she had worked every single day to make sure nobody ever had to feel sorry for her. Ever since the night her father's car was crushed on the interstate, leaving her with a shattered femur and nerve damage that never woke up, she had made a quiet promise to herself. She wouldn't be a burden. She wouldn't let her mother see how hard it was to walk across campus. She saved dollar by dollar from her late shifts at the grocery store on Pine Street for 8 long months, just to buy those specific crutches. They didn't hurt her hands. They let her feel like a normal student. And now, they were trash. A few students walked past on the far sidewalk, their heads down against the Seattle wind. They glanced over. They saw Brody holding the phone. They saw Khloe on the ground. And then, one by one, they looked away and kept walking. Not a single person stopped to ask if she needed a hand. It was the silence of the crowd that finally made her throat tighten. Then, a heavy, low rumble cut through the sound of the rain. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a deep mechanical idle that vibrated right through the concrete pavement. A single black motorcycle pulled up near the curb and stopped. The rider didn't rush. He turned off the engine, kicked the stand down, and walked over. He was an older man, probably late 50s, with gray hair sticking out from under his cap, and a heavy leather vest showing the Hell's Angels patch on the back. His face was lined, thinned out by years on the road, and his eyes were completely calm. He walked past Brody as if the boy wasn't even there, and knelt down right in the mud next to Khloe. "Take it easy," he said. His voice was quiet, rough from years of smoking, but completely steady. "Don't try to move that leg yet." He placed a large, calloused hand behind her shoulder, giving her just enough support so she could lean back against the low brick wall without sliding into the water. "They broke them," Khloe whispered. She tried to keep her voice flat, but it cracked on the last word. "I saved for 8 months." The man looked at the broken pieces of carbon fiber for a long second, his jaw moving slightly. Then he turned his head and looked at Brody. It wasn't a movie look. There was no shouting, no anger. It was just a cold, heavy stare that made Brody's smile disappear instantly. "Hey, we're just fooling around, man," Brody said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its confidence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. "Look, I've got cash. $300. That's more than enough for some plastic crutches." He tossed the bills toward the mud. The biker stood up slowly. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and heavy, blocking the light from the street lamp. "Pick up the money," the older man said quietly. Brody hesitated, looking back at his friends, but Tyler and Marcus were already backing away toward the library doors. "I said pick it up," the man repeated, his voice still low, but there was something in it that made Brody bend down immediately, his face turning red as he scooped the wet cash out of the puddle. The biker didn't pay any more attention to him. He pulled a black phone from his vest pocket and took 2 quiet pictures, one of Brody's face and one of the broken crutches in the mud. Then he looked down at Khloe. "My name is Luke," he said gently. "Folks call me Ghost. Tomorrow morning, Khloe, you won't be standing out here by yourself. I promise you that." He leaned down, picked her up carefully without a single complaint about the mud ruining his clothes, and carried her over to a large white pickup truck parked behind his bike. He set her gently into the warm passenger seat, went back to pick up the broken pieces of her crutches, and laid them carefully in the back of the truck like they were something valuable. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Khloe looked back through the wet glass. Brody Vance was still standing under the street lamp, looking at his phone, but he wasn't laughing anymore. He looked small in the rain. The heater in the white pickup truck hummed softly, blowing warm air against Khloe's freezing legs. She stared down at her scraped palms, where the small gravel from the parking lot had left deep, red imprints. Outside, the Seattle rain hit the windshield in steady, heavy sheets, blurring the taillights of the cars ahead of them. Luke kept both hands flat on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the dark highway. He didn't ask her a million questions. He didn't tell her that everything was going to be okay. He just drove. There was a comfort in his silence, the kind of quiet that only came from older people who had seen enough of the world to know that words usually couldn't fix a broken heart. "Take the next right," Khloe whispered, her voice still rough from the cold. "It's the small blue house at the end of the block." Luke nodded once, throwing the turn signal on with a heavy click. He pulled into the short gravel driveway and cut the engine. Before Khloe could even reach for the door handle, Luke was already out in the rain, walking around to the passenger side. He opened the door, leaned in, and lifted her up as easily as before. The front door opened before they even reached the porch. Khloe's mother, Sarah Miller, stood in the hallway, still wearing her dark blue uniform from her shift at the community hospital. Her face went pale as she looked at her daughter being carried by a massive man covered in leather and tattoos. "What happened? Oh my God, Khloe, what happened?" Sarah's voice trembled, her hands flying to her mouth. "She's all right, ma'am," Luke said quietly, his boots thudding against the hardwood floor as he carried Khloe into the small living room. He set her down gently onto the worn fabric sofa, making sure her bad leg was resting straight. "She had a fall at the school. Some boys broke her crutches." Sarah dropped to her knees beside the couch, her hands shaking as she touched Khloe's cold face. "The custom ones? The ones you worked all summer for?" Khloe just looked away, biting her lower lip so hard it turned white. She hated this moment more than the fall itself. She had spent 4 years trying to protect her mother from the reality of her disability. Her mother already carried the weight of losing her husband, working double shifts just to keep the mortgage paid. And now, another mess for her to clean up. Luke stood by the door, dripping water onto the welcome mat, watching them. His eyes drifted around the small room, settling on a faded, framed photograph sitting on the mantelpiece. It was a picture of a younger man in a military uniform, standing next to a little girl with a bright smile. "Your husband?" Luke asked, his voice low. "He passed away 4 years ago," Sarah said, wiping a tear from her cheek as she stood up. "Car accident. Khloe was in the passenger seat." Luke stared at the photograph for a long second. His jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching beneath his gray beard. He reached into his vest, pulled out a clean cotton handkerchief, and handed it to Sarah. "I'm going to make some tea," Luke said, pointing toward the kitchen as if he lived there. "You sit with her." A few minutes later, Luke came back carrying 2 mugs of black tea. He set one down on the coffee table in front of Khloe and took a seat in the old wooden rocking chair across from the sofa. The chair groaned under his weight. He looked at Khloe, really looked at her. Those boys. It wasn't the first time, was it? Khloe took a slow sip of the hot tea, letting the steam warm her face. She shook her head. Brody Vance has been doing it for 3 months. He thinks it's funny. He posts videos of me trying to get up the library stairs when it freezes. He calls me the broken engineer. I never told the school because his dad practically owns the athletic department. Nobody would have listened. Luke didn't curse. He didn't promise revenge. He just stared into his mug, his eyes turning dark and distant. 30 years ago, Luke said softly, his rough voice carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. I had a younger brother named Tommy. Tommy joined the Marines right out of high school, came back from his first tour across the ocean, without his left arm, and with a spine full of shrapnel. Luke paused, the rocking chair making a slow, rhythmic creak against the floor. The government gave him this old, heavy wheelchair that didn't fit through our mother's doorways. The wheels would stick, and the metal handles would tear the skin right off his palms. He was 22 years old, and he used to sit in the kitchen, staring at the floor, crying because he couldn't even get to the bathroom by himself. Our family didn't have the money for the good equipment, the custom stuff. Khloe looked up from her mug, her eyes locking onto Luke's weathered face. I used to carry him up the stairs every single night, Luke continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He passed away when he was 26. Complications from the infection. And for 26 years since then, I've been riding these roads, carrying a debt I never got to pay back to him. I watched my brother wither away because the world thought he wasn't worth the extra expense. Luke stood up, walked over to the couch, and set a small business card on the table next to Khloe's tea. You told me on the ride here that you wanted to build affordable mobility systems, Luke said, his voice turning firm, steady as iron. Don't you ever let some rich kid in a flashy jacket make you feel like that dream is too small. You hear me? Khloe felt a hot tear finally slip down her cheek, but she nodded. I hear you. I'll be back at dawn, Luke said, pulling his cap down low over his eyes. Get some sleep, kiddo. An hour later, Luke was sitting at the wooden table in his own small cottage on the edge of the city. The house was completely silent, except for the rain ticking against the window pane. On the refrigerator, a small Polaroid picture of Tommy in his hospital bed was held up by a magnet. Luke pulled his phone from his pocket. His calloused thumbs moved slowly across the screen as he opened a private encrypted messaging network used only by the high-ranking members of the Hells Angels across the state. He wrote the truth, short and cold. This is Ghost. Today at the Seattle Quad, 3 wealthy kids snapped a disabled student's crutches over a knee. They filmed her lying in the mud and laughed. The crowd walked past and nobody stopped. This girl is the daughter of a fallen veteran, and she's trying to build equipment to help other veterans. Tomorrow they plan to suspend her to shut her up. I need brothers who still care about honor. Come with respect, not weapons. Just show up. Seattle University, 6 a.m. Luke hit send. He laid the phone face down on the table, stood up, and walked over to the window, looking out into the dark, relentless storm. Within 2 minutes, the phone on the table began to buzz. Then it buzzed again. And again. The screen lit up the dark kitchen, notification after notification rolling in from Tacoma, from Spokane, from Olympia, and from across the state line. The brothers were rolling out. The old silver aluminum crutches Khloe borrowed from the hospital basement dug brutally into her armpits with every step she took. They were too heavy, poorly padded, and 2 inches too tall, forcing her shoulders up into an awkward, painful shrug. As she crossed the wet campus quad on Monday morning, the metal tubes clicked loudly against the concrete, a mocking reminder of what she had lost in the mud less than 24 hours ago. She kept her eyes flat on the path ahead, but she could feel the stares. She could hear the whispers traveling through the crowd of students huddled under umbrellas. Some looked at her with pity, others looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the raw reality of her struggle. But Khloe didn't care about the stares anymore. She just wanted to get to her structural engineering lab, slide into a back row seat, and disappear into her equations. She never made it to the lab. Just outside the lecture hall, a campus security officer blocked her path. He didn't look her in the eye. He just handed her a small, folded piece of white paper. It was a formal summons from the office of the Dean of Students. The word immediate was stamped across the top in sharp, red ink. When Khloe pushed open the heavy oak door to the administration office, the room went dead silent. She expected to see Dean Patricia Wren sitting alone at her desk. Instead, the large conference room was crowded. Brody Vance sat at the long mahogany table, wearing a clean, pressed suit instead of his varsity jacket. He looked entirely at ease, leaning back in his chair, tapping a silver pen against his knee. Next to him sat his father, Vance Morgan. The billionaire developer was a tall, silver-templed man wearing a tailored coat that cost more than Khloe's mother earned in 2 whole months. Flanking them were 2 sharp-eyed men in identical dark corporate suits, attorneys from the city's most expensive law firm. Dean Wren sat at the head of the table, looking pale, her hands tightly clasped over a thick manila folder. "Sit down, Miss Miller," Dean Wren said, her voice unusually tight, stripped of its usual warmth. Khloe managed to pull out a wooden chair, her borrowed crutches clattering loudly against the table leg as she sat down. She didn't look at Brody. She looked straight at the dean. "What is this about?" Before Dean Wren could speak, one of the attorneys stood up, tossing a glossy black tablet onto the center of the table. On the screen was a paused video, the exact footage Marcus had recorded of Khloe lying in the rain. "Miss Miller, my name is Arthur Pendleton, representing Morgan Construction and the Vance family," the lawyer said, his voice smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "We are here today to discuss a grave violation of the university's code of conduct. Specifically, an orchestrated campaign of extortion, defamation, and digital harassment targeting my client, Brody Vance." Khloe blinked, a cold chill dropping straight into her stomach. "What?" He snapped my crutches over his knee while I was on the ground. "What the video actually shows," Pendleton interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a knife, "is a highly edited, out-of-context interaction. We have filed a formal statement from 2 eyewitnesses, Tyler Brooks and Marcus Reed, confirming that you deliberately initiated a confrontation with Mr. Vance. You tripped over your own equipment, and when Mr. Vance attempted to help you up, your crutches, which were already structurally compromised, broke due to your own negligence." "That's a lie," Khloe whispered, her hands tightening on the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She looked at Dean Wren, her voice rising in desperation. "Dean Wren, you know me. I've been on this campus for 3 years. I save every cent I have. Why would I break my own crutches? There were dozens of students who saw him do it." Vance Morgan leaned forward, resting his massive, gold-ringed hands flat on the mahogany table. When he spoke, his voice carried the heavy, absolute authority of a man who bought and sold entire city blocks for breakfast. "Miss Miller," Vance Morgan said, his eyes narrowing, "let us be entirely honest here. My family has donated $6 million to this institution over the last 5 years. The very roof over your head right now was paid for by my company. My son has a spotless record, an athletic scholarship, and a future in the National League. I will not allow his name to be dragged through the mud by a bitter student looking for a financial handout or a housing upgrade from the university." He turned his cold gaze toward Dean Wren. "The university has a duty to protect its assets, Patricia. If this fraudulent story leaks to the local news stations, Morgan Construction will immediately freeze all funding for the new medical science wing. And our legal team will file a $20 million defamation lawsuit against this school before the sun sets today." Dean Wren swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the floor. She looked trapped, a tiny administrative gear caught between the crushing teeth of a billionaire's machine. "Khloe," Dean Wren said softly, refusing to look her in the eye. "Given the conflicting testimony and the severe nature of the allegations regarding corporate extortion, the university has made a decision. Effective immediately, you are placed on an emergency suspension for the remainder of the academic semester." The room felt like it was spinning. Khloe couldn't breathe. Suspension? For what? "For academic and behavioral misconduct," Dean Wren muttered, reading from a pre-written document on her desk. "Your access to the engineering labs is revoked. You are required to vacate your student housing within 48 hours. The university will conduct a full, private, internal investigation. Until then, you are not permitted on campus grounds." Brody Vance didn't say a word, but as Khloe looked across the table, he let out a tiny, silent smirk, a look of absolute triumph. He had won. The money had won. The truth didn't matter. The fact that she couldn't walk without pain didn't matter. To these men, she was just an insect to be crushed beneath an expensive leather shoe so their world could keep turning without a scratch. "We're done here," Vance Morgan said, standing up and buttoning his coat. "Make sure she signs the non-disclosure agreement before she leaves, Patricia. I don't want to see her face on this campus again." Khloe stood up, her borrowed aluminum crutches trembling beneath her weight. Her heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would break through her ribs, but she refused to let a single tear fall in front of them. She grabbed her heavy crutches, turned her back on the room of men in suits, and walked out into the long, empty corridor. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, she leaned against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in ragged, suffocating gasps. She was entirely alone. Her scholarship was gone. Her degree was gone. The world had just told her that because she was weak, and because she was poor, she didn't deserve to exist. She looked out the high glass window at the end of the hallway, watching the rain beat against the empty courtyard below. The clock on the wall read exactly 5 minutes to 6 in the morning. The cardboard boxes Khloe found behind the grocery store sat open on her small bedroom floor, smelling of stale dust and old produce. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her borrowed silver crutches leaning against the nightstand like two metallic guards marking her defeat. Her hands trembled as she lifted a stack of textbook folders, her senior seminar blueprints, and her hand-drawn sketches of modular braces, dropping them into the bottom of the box with a heavy, hollow thud. 48 hours. That was all the time the university had given her to erase 3 years of hard work. To the world outside, she was no longer a promising student of biomedical engineering. She was a liability, a corporate extortionist who had dared to stand in the way of a billionaire's son. Her mother, Sarah, stood in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow from a lack of sleep. She had tried to call the university administration office 4 separate times, only to be transferred to an automated legal department voicemail that refused to take her messages. "We can fight this, Khloe," Sarah said, her voice cracking as she watched her daughter pack. "We can find a lawyer. A cheap one. Someone from the legal aid clinic downtown." "With what money, Mom?" Khloe whispered, not looking up. A hot tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a dark circle on her blueprint paper. "Vance Morgan has more lawyers in his lobby than this entire city has public defenders. If we fight them, they will take this house. They'll take everything you have left. It's over." She pulled the small framed photograph of her father off the desk, wrapping it carefully in a wool sweater, before placing it at the top of the box. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with the realization that the wealthy didn't just break your things. They broke your future, and they made you thank them for the privilege. At exactly 5 o'clock in the morning, a heavy, familiar knock sounded at the front door. 3 slow, rhythmic thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. When Sarah opened the door, Luke stood on the porch. The Seattle rain was coming down lighter now, a cold, gray mist that clung to the silver bristles of his beard. He was wearing the same heavy leather vest, with the Hell's Angels patch on the back, his boots caked with fresh road grime. "Morning, ma'am," Luke said quietly, nodding to Sarah before walking straight into the living room where Khloe was sitting on her boxes. He took one look at her tear-stained face and the packed cardboard, his jaw tightening into a hard, still line. "Get your coat, Khloe," Luke said, his rough voice completely devoid of hesitation. "I can't go back there, Luke," Khloe said, her voice shaking as she gripped her borrowed aluminum crutches. "They suspended me. If campus security finds me on the grounds, they'll call the city police. I'll have a criminal record." Luke didn't argue. He didn't offer a grand speech. He just walked over, picked up her heavy winter jacket from the sofa, and held it open for her. "They told you that because they wanted you to hide in this room," Luke said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying absolute certainty. "They want you to think the world is small enough to fit inside their wallet. It isn't. Put your coat on. We're going to school." There was something in his presence, a quiet, immovable strength that made it impossible to say no. Khloe slipped her arms into the jacket, grabbed her awkward crutches, and followed him out into the freezing morning air. The drive back to Seattle University was completely silent. Luke kept the white pickup truck at a steady, unhurried pace, his large hands resting easy on the steering wheel. Khloe stared out the passenger window, watching the gray dawn slowly illuminate the empty streets of the city. Her stomach was twisted into a tight, agonizing knot. She felt like a prisoner being driven to a gallows. When the truck finally pulled into the main campus entrance, the clock on the dashboard read precisely 15 minutes to 6. The university quad was largely empty, save for a few early morning facility workers sweeping wet leaves near the library doors. Luke didn't park in the student lot. He pulled the heavy truck right up onto the concrete curb of the administration building, stopping directly in front of the wide stone steps where the oak office doors were located. A moment later, a sleek black town car pulled up on the opposite side of the driveway. The door opened, and Vance Morgan stepped out, flanked by his two attorneys in dark corporate coats. Brody Vance followed close behind, his varsity jacket zipped up against the chill, his phone already in his hand as he scrolled through his social media feed with a bored, distant expression. Vance Morgan stopped on the steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the stone. He noticed Luke's truck immediately. His eyes narrowed in undisguised contempt as he saw the massive biker step out of the driver's seat. "Harrison," Vance Morgan said, his voice carrying a cold, dismissive echo across the empty quad. "I thought the university made it clear that your presence is no longer tolerated on these grounds. If you don't remove this vehicle within 60 seconds, my lawyers will have the city marshal impound it." Luke didn't move. He just leaned back against the hood of his truck, crossing his heavy arms over his leather vest, staring at the billionaire developer with a calm, unbothered expression. "The 60 seconds are for you, Morgan," Luke said quietly. Brody Vance let out a short, mocking laugh from behind his father. "Look around, old man. It's 6 in the morning. Your little biker friend from yesterday isn't here to save you. You're alone." Right as the words left Brody's mouth, a low, faint vibration hummed through the concrete pavement. It was barely noticeable at first, a subtle trembling in the puddles of rainwater along the curb. But within 5 seconds, the hum deepened into a distant, rolling rumble that sounded like far-off thunder, even though the morning sky overhead was completely clear. The facility workers near the library stopped sweeping, turning their heads toward the eastern entrance of the campus. The rumble grew louder, heavier, resolving into a rhythmic, terrifying roar of mechanical energy. It was far more than one engine, far more than 5. It was an absolute wall of sound that shook the glass windows of the administration building. Rounding the curve of University Avenue, riding in a formation so precise it looked almost choreographed, came the motorcycles. Front headlights cut through the gray morning mist like a swarm of silver eyes. Chrome and dark leather stretched as far as the eye could see, a massive wave of iron rolling straight toward the university quad. At the front of the pack rode a broad-shouldered man with a long gray beard, his vest bearing the heavy insignia of the Tacoma chapter. Behind him came riders from Spokane, from Olympia, from Everett, dozens of men and women riding 2 by 2, their engines producing a thunderous chorus that completely drowned out the sound of the Seattle wind. Vance Morgan's attorneys froze on the steps, their professional composure vanishing instantly as the pavement beneath their feet began to bounce. Brody's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the stone steps unnoticed, his face turning an ash-gray color as the wall of 70 Hells Angels rolled into the parking lot, encircling the administration building like a ring of iron. One by one, 70 heavy V-twin engines cut out in perfect unison, the sudden silence rolling across the university quad like a heavy blanket. The deep mechanical roar that had shaken the glass windows just moments before resolved into an eerie, suffocating quiet. Every voice stayed low, and every engine stayed silent, out of pure, deliberate respect. 70 men and women, clad in heavy leather and denim, swung their legs off their motorcycles in smooth, unhurried movements, their heavy boots thudding sharply against the wet concrete. Their hands stayed open and empty, carrying nothing but their own presence. Instead, they walked forward with a calm, unstoppable cadence, forming a massive semicircle at the base of the administration building steps, effectively blocking Vance Morgan, his high-priced attorneys, and his son from leaving. It was a wall of absolute solidarity, a silent jury of strangers who had ridden through the night because honor still mattered. Luke walked to the passenger side of his truck, opened the door, and offered Khloe his hand. She gripped it, her fingers cold against his calloused palm, and swung herself down onto her borrowed silver aluminum crutches. Her heart was racing, but as she looked at the rows of leather-clad riders standing quietly behind Luke, the suffocating knot in her stomach began to loosen. For 3 years, she had felt invisible on this campus, a ghost navigating the margins of a world built for the wealthy. But today, 70 people were looking directly at her, their eyes filled with a quiet, protective respect. Windows across the quad began to slide open. Students who had been heading to their early 6 o'clock lectures stopped dead in their tracks, pulling out their phones. Within 3 minutes, a crowd of nearly 200 students had gathered along the perimeter of the parking lot, their cameras raised, capturing the massive row of motorcycles and the tense standoff on the steps. "What is the meaning of this?" Vance Morgan shouted, his voice cracking slightly, losing the smooth corporate composure he had used in the office just minutes before. He looked at the circle of riders, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. "Patricia, call campus security immediately. This is criminal trespassing. This is a riot." Dean Patricia Wren stepped out of the heavy oak doors, her face pale as she took in the sight of 70 Hell's Angels occupying her courtyard. She opened her mouth to speak, but Luke stepped forward, his massive frame cutting off her momentum. "There is no riot here, Dean Wren," Luke said, his rough voice carrying effortlessly over the damp morning air. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight behind his words made the 2 corporate attorneys take a small step backward. "Everyone here is standing on public ground, within their rights, making no threats to anyone. We are here as members of the public, witnessing a public matter on a public university campus. This is an administrative disciplinary issue," Arthur Pendleton, the lead attorney, stammered, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. "The university has already made its ruling. Miss Miller has been suspended based on official witness statements. Your presence here changes nothing." "The witness statements are a lie, and you know it," a voice called out from the edge of the student crowd. A young woman named Elena Vance, no relation to Brody, stepped forward from the gathering ring of students, her phone extended in her hand. She was a junior in Khloe's structural mechanics class, a girl Khloe had never spoken to before. "I have the unedited video," Elena said, her voice shaking with adrenaline as she looked directly at Brody Vance. "Marcus Reed posted the full 60-second clip to our floor's private group chat on Thursday night, before his father's lawyers made him delete it. I screen-recorded the whole thing because it made me sick to my stomach. It clearly shows Brody grabbing Khloe's right crutch, wrenching it away, and laughing while she fell into the mud. There was no confrontation. She was just trying to go home." The crowd of students let out a sharp, collective gasp. Dozens of phones tilted instantly toward Brody, who looked like he wanted the wet concrete to open up and swallow him whole. His arrogant posture had vanished completely, replaced by a twitching, terrified panic as he looked at his father. "Delete that immediately," Vance Morgan hissed, turning his furious gaze toward Elena. "I will have you expelled by noon, young lady." "You won't expel anyone, Morgan." A broad-shouldered rider named Big Tom walked up next to Luke, his vest bearing the insignia of the Spokane chapter. He had a thick gray beard and forearms like tree trunks. He looked at Vance Morgan with absolute disgust. "My daughter lost her leg in an accident 6 years ago. I know exactly what it looks like when a wealthy coward tries to bury the truth under a pile of cash. You think your money makes you invisible? Look around you. Every single camera on this campus is pointed at your son's face right now. The truth is out, and you can't buy enough commercial space to hide it." Luke turned his gaze back to Dean Wren, who was staring at Elena's phone, her eyes wide as the unedited footage played clearly in the gray morning light. "The decision is yours, Patricia," Luke said quietly, using her first name with a heavy, deliberate seriousness. "You can choose to protect the $6 million in corporate donations, or you can choose to protect the dignity of a student who actually earned her place here. But whatever you choose, you are going to do it out here in the open, where the whole city can see you." Dean Wren looked at Vance Morgan, then at the rows of silent riders, and finally at Khloe, who stood straight on her heavy aluminum crutches, her chin held high. The administrative mask finally cracked on the dean's face, replaced by a sharp, sudden look of moral resolution. "Mr. Morgan," Dean Wren said, her voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. "Your legal counsel advised me that no such footage existed. They assured me that the evidence was conclusive. They lied to my office. Patricia, listen to me," Vance Morgan began, his voice rising in panic. "No, you listen to me, Vance," Dean Wren interrupted, cutting him off with an absolute authority that left his attorneys speechless. "Your son's suspension will be processed immediately. Miss Miller's emergency suspension is canceled effective this very second. Your corporate legal team has exactly 10 minutes to leave my campus before I have security escort them off the property in handcuffs." A massive, roaring cheer erupted from the crowd of students, the sound echoing off the brick walls of the library. But among the 70 riders, there was no cheering. They simply stood fast as stone, their faces grim and resolved, watching as Vance Morgan, his attorneys, and a pale, trembling Brody Vance retreated back down the steps, their carefully built empire of influence shattering into pieces before the sun had even fully risen over Seattle. The official disciplinary hearing inside the university's administrative chamber lasted for nearly 3 hours, but for Brody Vance, the verdict had already been written the moment 70 motorcycles lined the quad. With Elena's unedited video presented as undeniable evidence, the university board moved with a swift, merciless precision that no amount of corporate money could stop. Brody Vance was officially expelled from Seattle University, his athletic scholarship permanently revoked, and his name stripped from the varsity sports roster. But the consequences didn't stop at the edge of the campus. Because the video had gone viral across multiple local news networks, the city prosecutor's office stepped in, charging Brody with misdemeanor assault and criminal destruction of property. To avoid jail time, his father's expensive attorneys negotiated a plea deal. The sentence was harsh: 500 hours of mandatory, unsupervised community service at the Seattle Veterans Rehabilitation and Mobility Center. For a young man who had spent his entire life in air-conditioned stadium lounges and luxury vehicles, the reality of his new life hit like a physical blow. The morning Brody reported for his first shift, his father, Vance Morgan, was nowhere to be found. The billionaire developer, furious that his company's stock had plunged 10% due to the public relations disaster, had completely cut Brody off from his financial accounts. He stripped Brody of his luxury car keys, canceled his credit cards, and forced him to move into a tiny, cramped studio apartment near the industrial docks, leaving him to survive on a minimum-wage grocery warehouse job. Brody stood in the damp, fluorescent-lit basement of the Veterans Center, wearing a plain gray jumpsuit instead of his custom varsity jacket. His hands, which had only ever gripped leather footballs, were already blistering from scrubbing the rust off old, heavy iron wheelchair frames. "You're late, Vance," a voice boomed from the shadow of the workshop. An older man named Sergeant Miller, a towering veteran with a prosthetic left arm and a face etched with decades of military service, walked out, holding a heavy wooden crate filled with bent aluminum tubes. He was the director of the center's equipment maintenance room, and he had zero patience for wealthy boys with bad attitudes. "I had to take the city bus," Brody muttered, looking down at his worn sneakers, his voice completely stripped of its former swagger. "It took me 40 minutes to get here." "I don't care if you walked on your hands," Sergeant Miller said, his voice flat and hard as a steel anvil. "Around here, we respect time, because the people using this equipment don't have any to waste. You see those crates over there? Those are manual wheelchairs and heavy aluminum braces from the old state hospital. They need to be completely disassembled, cleaned, and re-greased by 5 o'clock tonight. Get to work." For the first 2 weeks, Brody resisted. He moved slowly, complaining under his breath, hoping that his father would eventually change his mind and send a lawyer to rescue him. But no rescue came. Every day, he had to look at the consequences of his actions. He had to watch old men, veterans who had sacrificed their bodies for the country, struggling to move down the corridors because their equipment was clunky, heavy, and ill-fitting. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Brody was dragging a heavy crate of iron wheel hubs across the floor when he stopped outside the main physical therapy room. Through the glass window, he saw an older veteran named Thomas, a man who had lost his leg in a helicopter crash decades ago. Thomas was trying to take a few steps using an old pair of heavy steel crutches, his face contorted in pain as the unpadded metal cuffs rubbed against his wrists until they bled. Brody froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sight of Thomas struggling, the sound of the metal clicking loudly against the linoleum floor, was an exact mirror of what he had done to Khloe Miller in the parking lot. For the first time in 22 years, the thick bubble of arrogance around Brody completely shattered. What he saw now had nothing to do with an internet video or social media clicks. He saw real, raw human suffering, and he finally realized that his careless cruelty had real, devastating echoes in the lives of ordinary people. He sat down on his wooden work stool in the dark basement, surrounded by the smell of grease and old metal, and he covered his face with his calloused hands. He didn't sleep that night. For the next 3 days, the memory of Khloe's tear-stained face in the rain haunted him, a heavy, suffocating weight of genuine shame that no amount of money could ever wash away. 6 months passed like a blur of grease, blue ink, and late-night study sessions. The tiny garage behind Luke's cottage had been converted into a makeshift engineering workshop, funded entirely by small donations from across the state, and the constant support of the Hells Angels brothers. Khloe sat at a wooden workbench, her new black custom crutches resting neatly beside her chair, as she tightened the final locking pin on a sleek, dark blue aluminum leg brace. This was the first official production run of the Miller-Harrison mobility system. It was modular, lightweight, and engineered from incredibly durable, low-cost composite materials. The design allowed the cuffs and tubes to adjust by up to 4 inches, meaning a person could modify the gear as they recovered or grew, without ever having to buy a whole new set every few months. "That's the last one for the morning batch," Luke said, walking into the garage carrying 2 large wooden shipping crates. He looked down at the row of 12 beautifully crafted crutches, a quiet, rare smile breaking through his silver beard. "The van from the Seattle Veterans Center is arriving at 11 o'clock to pick up the donation. You ready to head over there?" Khloe took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the tiny winged emblem etched into the blue aluminum frame. "I'm ready, Luke. Let's go see if they work in the real world." When Luke's pickup truck pulled into the loading dock of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, the air was crisp and smelling of rain. Khloe moved with a steady, confident rhythm on her crutches, no longer bracing for every stare, her posture straight and proud. She followed Luke into the large basement workshop where the center's old equipment was kept. Standing near a heavy industrial cleaning tub, his back turned to them, was a young man scraping rust off an old steel wheelchair frame. His hair was cut short, his shoulders were thinned out, and his plain gray jumpsuit was covered in grease stains. As the heavy metal door clicked shut, the young man turned around. It was Brody Vance. Khloe froze, her hands tightening slightly on her grips. She hadn't seen him since the morning on the quad 6 months ago. The arrogant football star who used to look down on her with absolute contempt was gone. In his place stood a young man whose face was lined with genuine exhaustion, his hands covered in dark grease and bandages from heavy labor. Brody's eyes widened as he looked at Khloe. He looked at her new crutches, then at the crate of beautiful blue mobility equipment Luke was setting onto the table. His face flushed a deep red, but he didn't look away this time out of anger. He looked down at his own calloused hands, a heavy, suffocating silence hanging in the air. "Vance!" Sergeant Miller called out from the office doorway. "Stop scrubbing for a minute. Miss Miller and Mr. Harrison just brought in the first delivery of our new modular braces. I want you to help unload them." Brody swallowed hard, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He slowly walked over to the wooden table, stopping exactly 3 feet away from Khloe. Luke stepped forward, his massive 6'4" frame casting a long shadow over the young man, his dark eyes watching Brody's every movement with an icy, dangerous stillness. But Brody didn't offer an excuse. He didn't sneer. Instead, he did something that left the entire room in absolute silence. Brody Vance looked directly into Khloe's eyes, and then he slowly bowed his head, his shoulders dropping in a gesture of absolute humility and remorse. "I'm sorry, Khloe," Brody said, his voice dropping to a low, trembling whisper that was completely devoid of his former pride. I know 1,000 apologies can't fix what I did to you in the rain. I know I destroyed something that took you 8 months of your life to buy. I was a coward, and I treated you like you weren't even a real person just to get clicks on a screen. He reached into his jumpsuit pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather ledger. He set it gently on the table next to the new crutches. I've been keeping track of every hour I work here, Brody continued, a tear finally cutting a clean line through the grease on his cheek. My father cut me off completely. I live in a tiny room by the docks now, and I work the night shift at a shipping warehouse, just to pay rent. But I don't want his money to fix this. I've saved $400 from my own wages over the last 3 months. It's in this ledger. I want to give it to your foundation, and if you'll let me, when my 500 hours of mandatory service are finished next week, I want to keep volunteering at your workshop, for free, on weekends. I want to help build these braces so no one else has to feel the pain I caused. Khloe stared at the leather ledger, then looked at Brody's face. She could see the truth in his eyes, the raw, painful reality of a young man who had finally been forced to sit with his own cruelty until it broke him down and rebuilt his character from scratch. This wasn't a scripted apology for a camera. This was a human being learning what respect actually meant. The money goes into the materials fund for the veterans, Khloe said quietly, her voice steady and calm. And as for the workshop, we start manufacturing at 7 o'clock every Saturday morning. If you're late even by 1 single minute, Luke will lock the gates. Do you understand? Brody looked up, his eyes wiping away a tear as a small flicker of genuine relief crossed his face. He nodded quickly. I'll be there at 6:30, Khloe. I promise. Luke looked at Brody for a long second, his jaw moving slightly beneath his silver beard, before he reached out a massive, tattooed hand and patted the young man's shoulder once. It wasn't a gesture of total forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement of respect. The lesson had been learned. The price had been paid, and out of the mud of that rainy Thursday afternoon, something decent had finally begun to grow. The spring sky over Seattle had finally cleared, leaving long, pale streaks of golden sunlight cutting through the morning mist. The main university stadium was completely packed, crowded with hundreds of celebrating families, waving banners, and rows of graduating students wearing dark blue academic gowns. Khloe Miller stood near the edge of the tunnel leading onto the grass field, smoothing down the fabric of her gown. Her mother, Sarah, stood right beside her, fixing the yellow engineering sash around Khloe's neck with trembling, emotional fingers. Your father would have been so proud, Khloe, Sarah whispered, a warm tear slipping down her cheek as she squeezed her daughter's shoulder. He always knew you were going to build something incredible. I didn't build it alone, Mom, Khloe said gently, her voice steady and filled with a profound calm. She looked down at the crutches supporting her weight. They were no longer the heavy, awkward aluminum tubes borrowed from the hospital basement, nor the expensive custom carbon fiber ones that had been destroyed in the mud. These were completely unique, crafted from dark, matte blue composite materials with custom molded silicone cuffs that distributed her weight perfectly. Etched neatly into the side of the metal was the official name of her foundation, the Miller-Harrison Mobility System. It was the final, production-ready model that was already being shipped to 3 major regional rehabilitation centers across the state. Next graduate, the university marshal called out through the microphone, his voice echoing loudly across the stadium speakers. Khloe Marie Miller, Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering. Khloe stepped forward into the bright sunlight, the crowd erupting into polite applause as she made her way toward the center stage. She walked with an absolute, undeniable certainty. Every step was smooth, balanced, and proud. Her steps carried none of the old hesitation. She climbed the stairs without fear and met the stares of the crowd head-on. She had spent 3 years trying to hide her struggle, but today, she was walking in the light, showing the entire world that her difference wasn't a failure. It was the very foundation of her strength. As the dean handed her the leather-bound diploma, a sudden deep rumble rolled over the outer walls of the stadium. It was a sound too deep for thunder, too heavy for any crowd. It was the low, unmistakable mechanical roar of Mobilizing V-twin engines. 70 motorcycles, parked in a massive, flawless double row right outside the main stadium gates, rumbled to life in perfect unison. The Hells Angels brothers had returned. They stayed outside the stadium, letting the ceremony continue undisturbed. They simply stood by their heavy steel bikes, their leather vests gleaming in the afternoon sun, their engines producing a powerful, rhythmic chorus that shook the concrete stands. It was their way of paying tribute, a wall of pure respect, celebrating one of their own. When the ceremony finally ended, Khloe made her way through the dispersing crowd toward the outer gates. Standing at the front of the massive row of motorcycles was Luke. He was wearing his gray cap pulled low, his heavy leather vest dark with road dust, his arms crossed over his chest. Next to him stood Big Tom and Brody Vance, who was wearing his grease-stained workshop apron, holding a small wooden box filled with new composite blueprint designs. Luke didn't offer a loud congratulation. He just waited until Khloe reached the bottom step, his thinned-out, weathered face softening into a genuine, proud smile. "You did good out there, kiddo," Luke said, his rough voice cracking slightly as he looked at her diploma. "You stood up right in front of them." "We stood up, Ghost," Khloe corrected quietly, leaning forward to pull the massive biker into a tight, warm embrace. Her face pressed against the rough leather of his vest, the same solid, immovable shelter that had found her lying in the mud 12 months ago. Luke pulled back slowly, reaching into his inner vest pocket. He pulled out a small, faded Polaroid photograph, the picture of his younger brother Tommy smiling from his old military hospital bed. He laid it gently into Khloe's hand, his fingers resting over hers for a long second. "I've been carrying this picture for 26 years, waiting to pay a debt I thought I owed to the dead," Luke said, his voice dropping to a low whisper that only she could hear. "But looking at you today, and looking at the braces you built for those old men in the basement, I think Tommy's debt is finally settled. I want you to carry his picture in your workshop bag now, to remind you of why we don't look away." Khloe looked down at Tommy's bright, laughing eyes, then at the rows of 70 riders waiting patiently behind Luke to escort her home. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry out of sadness anymore. She felt an incredible, burning sense of purpose rising in her chest. "What's next, Khloe?" Brody Vance asked quietly from the side, his ledger clutched in his hand, his eyes filled with a ready, focused respect. Khloe looked at the dark blue crutches in her hands, then out at the long, open highway stretching out beyond the campus gates. "We have a lot of work to do," Khloe said, a beautiful smile breaking across her face as the 70 engines rose into a final, thunderous chorus of victory. "We're just getting started." And as the thunderous rumble of 70 engines faded into the Seattle horizon, it left behind something far greater than justice. It left a reminder that when we refuse to look away from someone in need, we give them the strength to stand up and change the world. Thank you for listening to this journey on Heart Tales. If this story touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button and join our family. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a single act of kindness that completely changed someone's life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And don't go just yet. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to discover another deeply emotional story. Until next time, take care of each other.